you know, someone coming in here might just think we've entered an open wild area, but actually this is actually a very well maintained garden.
Maintained. Yes, well
managed. Okay, this is very, actually a managed garden.
It's mostly very intentional. I do have a tendency of, if things come up, I do let them until they create a problem, because most things are useful eventually. We've got a little what's it called? River mimosa. It's not actually a mimosa, it's an indigenous riverine tree here, which springs up all over the place, and it's allowed to until roughly this height, and then it's cut down again. But it's like a lot of the legumes, it's adding nitrogen to the soil. It's basically sort of free fertilizer, so just chopping and dropping this periodically. I didn't plant it there, it came up there, but it can stay while it doesn't misbehave. So yeah, so managed, yes, it's definitely not tidy. I will acknowledge that, but it's very alive, which is what I was mostly aiming for.
So one thing I like about all this accumulated leaf litter and the moisture under this canopy is just how well your ferns are doing. Because I know ferns do like this understory.
A lot of ferns do. Some of the ferns you struggle with. This one is actually really easy because, sorry, I'll redo that. So this one is really easy because it is actually kind of succulent. Now this is actually another edible thing. It's not palatable. You clean that off. It's a very refreshing water-filled thing, but if you're not really thirsty, you're going to mostly notice how astringent it is. In parts of the Philippines, they are roasted and eaten as a snack.
Really?
But
the common, because I refer this as the common garden fern.
Yeah, so this is actually a confusing fern. So this is probably originally Australian. It is found throughout the tropics, but it is much hardier than most of the ones we consider native here because it has this succulent feature. And yeah, it doesn't taste great when you're not really thirsty and it's not roasted. It's kind of astringent. I do want to try roasting them, but because of that, it survives much more drought. But again, it won't survive full drought in the dry season. Here, it usually doesn't get water. This particular patch is not one I water further down. I water further that way because there's more sensitive things. But this fern survives year round without watering. It is quite hardy like that. The one that is truly indigenous, sorry.
It's so common, he's just throwing
I don't really mind what happens to that fern. Trying to stop its spread is the main thing I'm doing now. This one, which is another Nephrolipis, is closely related.
Okay.
So this is Nepenthes Exaltica, I think. So this is indigenous, mostly in riverine areas. It can also survive year round. These stems hold a lot more water. And so this one, if you establish it in the rainy season in a shady environment like this, yeah, it will do absolutely fine. So the canopy does create opportunities for a lot more shade-loving things.
And just confirm, in the dry season, do you water this area at all?
So from this grapefruit tree down, which most people wouldn't put it in this much shade, I know, but it seems perfectly happy. From here down, I water it about once a month during the dry season. But from that sort of central section, not really, no.
Okay, so you have kind of zoned off in
I have zoned off, so where I've put things that I am more concerned about they're drying out, because citrus don't really like a long dry season, things like that, I will put some water, probably a lot less than I would need to if they were in fully open habitats. Talk about those. I think one of the things tend to last longer if I find out I can eat them. So this is one a lot of people find coming up in shady parts of their garden. It's not indigenous. This is Polynesian arrowroot. So have you ever had a really old tapioca pudding? That was made of the root of this.
Right.
So this is a fantastic starch. It is complicated to harvest, but it pops up quite merrily if you create a low, dense shade like this. And it is a starchy tuber. You can basically pound it to get a flour out of it, which can then be used to thicken things and to make pancakes. Basically like a very loose wheat flour. So that's one I really like, and I really love the look of it. It's quite similar to some of our native sort of aroid type plants. I'm constantly trying to get more useful vines, but the philodendron is a good sort of shelter against the base of the tree to begin with. There is another philodendron around the other side, which I think a lot of people don't realize how useful it is.
Why would you describe this philodendron as useful?
That one I wouldn't. That is purely ornamental. It is toxic, so it's a barrier plant, and it's quite a nice dry season flower for a lot of pollinators.
And I see you've got Syngonium there.
Yes, that one, someone gave me one, and I have been trying to eradicate it ever since, with mixed success. It's great biomass, I will say that in its favor. It is, again, as with all the aroids, it's quite a different chemistry. So if it's not actively choking something, it's not bad. But the only philodendron that is really useful to my knowledge is this one. So this is Monstra deliciosa, and the clue is in the name. The leaf is toxic, as are they all, but up here, sorry, you probably can't see that from there. Up here you have a very weird fruit coming. This is not ready yet. You will see the scales start to come off, usually from the base, and then spreading towards the tip when it is ready. And as soon as the ants start going for it, that's when you start eating it. Before that, it will give you kidney stones. But when it is perfectly ripe, it tastes like this beautiful melt in your mouth pineapple and banana combination. It's absolutely fantastic. It is one of the most delicious fruits, but very risky if you get it before it's ready.
Okay.
Very slow maturing. This can be about 6 months on the plant before it's ready to eat. So this is another one that is very ornamental. A lot of people think it's non-native. This is gingerbush. It's actually fairly common in some riverine settings in Zambia as an indigenous plant. It's not edible. It has a fantastic smell, which you're welcome to have a sniff of if you want. But it is quite medicinal. It is not one I would recommend self-utilizing, but a lot of traditional healers will use it. It is a useful plant. Again, it's quite different to a lot of other things you'd have in the garden. Don't plant it near your mint because it's reasonably related to those, but it is a very different toxin, and it grows very vigorously, so you're constantly getting more you can add to the soil. So it's a nice one because it flowers fantastically. It's fairly toxic, it looks nice, and it is actually quite native.
Okay, interesting. It does smell very strongly of ginger.
Yeah.
But you're saying we can't cook it?
You can make a tea with it, but it's mostly for medicinal reasons.
And not advisable if you don't know what you're doing.
I wouldn't personally do it without the guidance of someone who's been doing it for much, much longer. There's a different gingery type plant, if I can sort of lead you further into the thicket again. So this is an Odontonema, which is really just for the pollinators. Then this one. So this one, which I was always raised being taught was wild ginger, it's not indigenous here. This is actually an Indonesian tree. This is an Indonesian plant, but it is quite aromatic. Again, you can have a sniff of that. It doesn't smell like traditional ginger.
It's aromatic, but not like ginger.
It's really aromatic, but it makes a very soothing tea. And also you can use it as a flavoring, like a bay leaf you would. You put it in rice, it'll give that lovely aromatic sort of edge to its flavor, which I really appreciate.
Flowers?
The flowers come out sort of white and pink. There might be some around. It's almost always flowering at this time of year.
Okay. Because flowers are basically the best way to identify.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell this is an Alpinia, which is the group of gingers it's in, because the flower comes out at the tip. Okay. Whereas like the turmerics, the edible gingers, a lot of the indigenous gingers, the flowers come out at the base. Costus, they come out at the tip again, but most of the indigenous ones, they'll come out straight from the soil. Okay.
Now I'm just wondering if someone has this or someone is curious about trying the tea, how do they know
this is actually the standard garden ginger in Zambia. So you'll have this plain leaf form, and as far as I know, the only common variegated ginger in Zambia is this one, which is the exact same species. It's just a variegated mutant. You can see again it has this little tip flower, which is very common to the Alpinia. The other Alpinia you'll find growing in Zambia is Alpinia galangala, I think, which is the galangal, which is much more tropical, a little bit more tricky, but that's the root you'd mostly eat. But if you did try and use the leaf for tea, it won't do you any harm at all. So you're not going to have much trouble with Alpinias generally. They are a friendly little tree. I keep saying tree.
Can you do anything with the roots?
The root isn't massively toxic. As far as I know, it's used as a famine food in places, but it's not palatable. So similar to the butterfly ginger, you can dry it out, pound it up, use it as flour. You won't enjoy it, but you won't die or starve. Very fibrous.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Never know when we're going to have our next famine.
Another dubious one. So this is complicated. So this is arguably one of the least edible palm trees in many ways. So this is a fishtail palm. You can tell the fishtails because they're the only palms with this bizarre double branching leaf. So you have the main stem, which then branches off again. So these are the caryotas. These are mostly South Asian, as far as I know. The fruit is full of oxalates, which are not pleasant for your gut, and if they do get into your bloodstream, they are the same thing that is in the monster that will give you kidney stones. But when it flowers, which it does much quicker than any other palm, this is one of the fastest growing palms, it flowers once and then it dies. But this clumping version, if you then cut into those flower stems, and basically traditionally you would use an earthenware pot, but you can put a container over that cut flower stem, that will bleed sap into it, which you can boil off to make jaggery, a sort of palm sugar. So it is usable and edible in that way. It is not one I would try palm heart from. You probably could, but I wouldn't want to risk it. But certainly for sugar, it is one that I plan to use once I have established a bigger colony.
So I noticed that you have this Dracaena on the ground. What are the plans with that?
So this is an ongoing effort. A friend of mine gave me a whole bunch of cocoa seedlings, which is something I had in my long-term plan, but I hadn't expected now. So I'm trying to create, hopefully, the ideal conditions, because this is a sub-canopy tree from very dense rainforests, more tropical, more lowland than us. Our light is too intense, our seasons get too dry, but it does have similar requirements for jackfruit, which I've had a lot of success with in the past. So what we're doing is we're using this Dracaena, which is going to go just about here to block the winter sun, which is going to come in from the north there. And then I've got a couple of these mascarene palms, red princess palms they're also called, or hurricane palms. They're a lovely little shade-loving ornamental palm. That is also another edible one. You can eat the heart of that. But that is going to be going in here to block the morning sun. And then we've got a nice little custard apple. This is actually one from seed, which is going to be going here as a toxic barrier. And then right in the middle, I've got a little cocoa sapling who's going to be going right up against these gingers, so it stays nice and sheltered year round. And as it comes up, most of these things can be pruned quite a lot, so as I need to change the amount of light it's getting, all of them will tolerate that. None of these have particularly invasive root systems, so they should get on absolutely fine. But that is, the hope is that we can keep it alive through the cold season, because cocoa ever goes below 10 degrees, it can die, and that is Celsius, not Fahrenheit. So that's the real challenge, and that was part of the long-term plan with building this thicket, was to get truly tropical trees in here, because as we create a more permanent humidity, as we create more permanent shelter, you can actually grow a lot of things you wouldn't think would thrive in Zambia without much trouble. Like jackfruit, once it's established, I've even had seedlings here. That is a very tropical tree. I've had seedlings survive with no water at all through a dry season within the thicket, because it is closer to their natural environment. Sorry. You're
definitely a glass half full person, because I'm standing here thinking that this space is packed.
Oh no.
And so I'm thinking you've already mentioned 3 trees in this tiny little...
But none of these are big trees. So this ginger, which you can see is filling up most of the space, that I can cut that right down to the ground, it will come back up. You can chop it out. I will chop it out. It doesn't mind being propagated at all. So as these grow, things will be cut back. Palm trees, most of them have a fairly contained root ball. Princess palms are not a big palm. You can take off the side leaves. They're notorious for dropping those when they're stressed in sort of high wind situations. They can regrow very quickly from losing those. So I can create as much light and space as I need, provided it has sort of a foot clearance around its base in all directions from large plants. It's going to be absolutely fine. The big thing is don't let it get cold. And so you can think of these as a disposable blanket. They'll come off when they need to come off. They'll be on when it needs them.
So you're basically just pruning your garden as and when, shaping it.
And everything that gets pruned, and here you've seen quite a deep layer, everything that gets pruned just adds back into the soil, brings it back to life.